All right, so what is a genre and why do we talk about them so much when it comes to things like stories? Now, when we talk about genre, I kind of want you to imagine the things that you were taught in school when it comes to animals and the domains and kingdoms that the animal kingdom has. For instance, we have mammals, we have marsupials, we have fish, we have non-mammals, reptiles. There's other things for sure that I'm definitely forgetting. But there's also an idea that there are different branches of each of these families. So if we look over here, we can see that there is a general family. Here, we can break it down into other smaller groups throughout, and those groups keep on getting smaller. Now, the important thing here is genre is simply a way for us to categorize something, just as the animal kingdoms are a way for us to categorize something. So, if it's a way for us to categorize something, what are we categorizing? So genres, specifically when we're talking about books and movies and other such creative niches, when we talk about genre, we're talking about what kind of things that these are, what shared traits they have in common, such as tropes, which are elements of story, themes, such as ideas that are commonly portrayed in different genres or types of stories, and just common similarities between them in a web or a tree or a kind of root system that we see here. Now, from that, what is the actual purpose of genre? So the actual purpose of genre when it comes to stories and fiction is actually to have an idea of what we are selling. So I know it sounds kind of sad that it's all about what we're selling, but it is kind of important. Say you walk into a bookstore. I'm friends with some bookstore owners. They've got a great bookstore, but what would happen if they tried to mix, let's say, fantasy, which is a common genre, and romance, which is also a very common and well-selling genre. Let's say that they have them just mixed throughout the shop, not in their proper shelves. This is why genres are important, because it allows booksellers, and such as Amazon, Kobo, etc., to be able to determine, okay, this book has this trait, this book is within the genre of fantasy, and therefore we are able to sell it with other books like it. So we're able to categorize the book and know elements that it is probably using, and know that this group of readers here that like these books are also going to like this book most likely, because it shares very, very common traits down to a DNA root level. Now, as I said earlier, these trees can branch down, or the root system rather, looks more like root system, it's cooler that way, can keep going and branching down to incredibly small little genres, and new genres are created every day by new blending of different ideas and genres. Now, genres aren't necessarily, by definition, solid or rigid. Let's take sci-fi and fantasy, for example. In this series, I would like to break down a bunch of my favorite genres, specifically within science fiction and fantasy, because that's what I write as an author. But where is the line between that? Let's take one of my favorite books, for example. Let me grab it off the shelf. All right, I have a handful of my favorite books here. So this is The Wheel of Time, the first book, The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. That series was later finished by Brandon Sanderson. I also have a bunch of his books. I just have to do some weightlifting by grabbing those off the shelf. I also have an Orson Scott Card book. I thought this was Ender's Game when I grabbed it. Nope, it's Speaker of the Dead, for the Dead. Then we have Dune. Now, all of these books are categorized into different genres. Dune is typically considered a sci-fi book. Robert Jordan's The Eye of the World from The Wheel of Time is typically considered a hard fantasy or epic fantasy book. A little bit pulpier side because of the era that it was written in, but it's phenomenal. And then we have Speaker for the Dead, which is part of the Ender Quintet, I believe, or the Ender's Game Quintet. And this is typically considered to be sci-fi. Now, all of these books have a couple things in common. The elements, they all have main characters, which is great. They're all fiction, great, which is another type of genre. We have two categorizing genres, which is fiction, nonfiction, and those are just the main two kingdoms, or the main two animal kingdoms that we see within books, stories, and movies. This can apply to movies as well, and isn't necessarily just for books. Now, let's look a little bit deeper into this book specifically, which is The Eye of the World. Within Eye of the World, we actually see that later on, you discover that, wait a second, is this set on Earth? Perhaps, perhaps not. Similar to a book like Sword of Shannara or other such fantasy books, where we see yes, it's got swords and it's got dragons and it's got other tropes and elements that are very common to fantasy, and it is, at its core, a fantasy book, but at the same time, behind it, there is technology, there's science fiction, there's other such elements, but hidden behind a gauze of fantasy. The same thing happens for Frank Herbert's Dune. We see that, yes, they're in space, yes, they can travel between planets, yes, they have spaceships and all this hard sci-fi stuff, but then again, a lot of the actual contents of Dune and the original trilogy, or the quintet, I don't actually remember exactly, is not exactly hard sci-fi, not as much as you would see in perhaps books that are considered to be hard sci-fi. For example, books like Isaac Asimov would write, such as I, Robot or The Foundation, which would be a lot more hard sci-fi. But again, that could be argued to have elements of fantasy within it. So what my argument here is, Dune, for example, Paul's entire journey tends to be one that is much more a fantasy book style journey, character-wise and element-wise, than it is hard sci-fi. So take a considered sci-fi book and a fantasy book, and really they are blending together. It's like, have you ever tried to put a book's pages together and tried to pull it apart? I did that very poorly. That did not work. Anyways, you can't pull pages apart if you lay all of the pages over top of one another. You try to pull it apart. It's very similar to that in genre, where these books, which may be in sci-fi and one in fantasy, are similar and share traits and share genres and subgenres within them. So no genre is rigid. That is my point with this whole rant. Go read Ender's Game. It's great. That is it for our first episode of What is Genre and Genre Breakdowns. If you enjoyed it, I hope you'll come back and do more breakdowns with us. So thank you for joining me, and I'm going to go finish this coffee. Blessings.